Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story, our first episode of 2019, and this is episode 27. Thank you for joining each week as I find different people who have inspired or encouraged, or I've heard bits and pieces of their stories, and I wanted to bring them and introduce them to you. I am thrilled this week to have my special guest, Liz Kleinrock, on. And Liz, I'll kind of let you introduce yourself to the group.
Sure. Oh, hi. My name is Liz Kleinrock. I am an elementary educator in Los Angeles, California. Been in the classroom, oh my goodness, like almost 10 years, which is crazy. And I've taught first, second, third, fourth, and fifth grades. I try to teach with an equity-focused and culturally responsive lens. So that's really been the focus of my work for the past few years. And thank you so much for having me. And I didn't know I was the first guest of 2019. I feel very special.
That's right. You're kicking off the year right. There we go. Well, I've followed you for a little while, Liz, on Instagram, and just love the work that you're doing and the passion that you have, and how you seem to be this fearless person who just wants to do better and be better, not only for kids but for everyone. But let's start with talking a little bit about you and education. So, when did you know you wanted to become a teacher?
Oof, pretty late, not until college. In high school, I had done some volunteering with a daycare center that served families who were experiencing homelessness. But it was kind of like this cute thing I would do. I really liked working with these little kids, but didn't really consider that as a career path. In college, one of my roommates headed up this organization called Each One Teach One, and we went into public schools in nearby communities. I went to school in St. Louis. And did after school tutoring. And I really, really loved working with students. I think the oldest kids we had were middle schoolers, but every week it was something that I looked forward to. And I was headed to finish up my credits early, so I was able to tack on a children's studies minor. And after graduating, I got a job teaching through AmeriCorps in Oakland, and kind of figured, this is something I've enjoyed. I'll try it out. And if I don't like it, I'll try something else. But it stuck. And like a decade later, here I am.
What has been your favorite part of being a teacher?
Oh, the relationships that I get to build with my students and families is amazing. There are students who I had years ago, and I'm still very close with their families. So I get to see them go from elementary school, and they're now in middle school, and they're like taller than me. I always really liked the quote, like, what is legacy? I think it's from Hamilton. It's like planting seeds in a garden that you never get to see. But I feel like when you maintain these relationships, like, you actually do get to see that garden grow. That's so cheesy. But it's been really wonderful being able to see like the impact that this work has on kids and how it shapes their lens as they get older.
Love it. Well, and you're quite active on social media, and really Instagram. Where did that kind of come from? Is it just something you just fell into, or you really pursued it?
It was kind of like this happy accident. I had posted some samples of student work, some lessons that I did that I was always really proud of on my Facebook and my personal Instagram. And a year ago, this past fall, I was sitting in a training. I was not paying very close attention, I do admit. Thinking, I really want a place that can kind of become like a portfolio for all of the work that I'm doing. And quite frankly, the majority of people I'm friends with on social media might not really care about what I'm doing in the classroom. So I think I should just create this separate space where I can kind of host all the things that I'm doing and, try to connect with other teachers who are like-minded. So I wanted to have a name with alliteration. So I remember texting with my advisor from UCLA, who I'm still very close with, and we ran through all these different names with alliteration. I had to double check to see if like domain names were correct. This is not like a very exciting story. But that's how we came up with Teach and Transform. And I love the idea that education can be transformative. Mm-hmm. I had no background knowledge about how to cultivate a social media following or anything. Like, no one told me like how hashtags work. So if you go back in my posts, like, they look very different than how they look now.
Right.
But it was really amazing to see right off the bat that there are so many educators out there who are using this platform to make connections and to kind of use social media as their own form of professional development. And I think that's such a powerful tool. And you get to hear from the experiences of teachers in all different settings who work in all different types of communities. And just there's so much knowledge to be found. I feel like that can be the overwhelming part.
Were you ever nervous to share your stuff on social media?
Not really. My school is really supportive of the type of work that I do, and to the point where it's a priority of my school to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I feel very safe and protected there, which is really nice. Any concerns that I did have revolved more around wanting to make sure that what I shared wasn't violating student confidentiality, looking at FERPA, like the Family Education Privacy, things like that, and just making sure that what I was doing was aligned with our school and I was representing my community, in a positive light.
Well, and I love that, one thing that I see a lot on your account is there's a lot of activism and education of just the whole idea of race and social injustice and this idea of making sure we are educated and not afraid to tackle these conversations. Has that always been something that you've been really passionate about?
Very much so. I think as I've gotten older, that piece has evolved. I was raised in a Quaker school. So this idea of like philanthropy and being connected to your community is something that's, been a part of my upbringing since I was very small. And it's something that my family emphasized as well. Cutting class to go protest the war in Iraq. I grew up in DC, so there was like never a shortage of protests. I remember my 7th grade English teacher taking us to protest the genocide in Sudan outside the Sudanese embassy. I remember protesting the recount in the 2000 election in Florida with my mom and dad. So I feel like growing up in that environment also gave me a lot of insight into ways that you can use your voice in order to make change, even if you're young.
So why do you feel that it's important to constantly be on like your social media platform and pushing that thinking and sharing those ideas with other educators? Because I'm sure, the topic of race and inclusivity and all that can sometimes end up very controversial. And so I'm sure that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it can get exhausting too, just the pushback you probably receive from people you've never even met.
I definitely agree with that. I think there's a lot of discomfort in navigating these issues, even with adults. There's a lot that we haven't unpacked as a society. Like I'm adopted, my family is white, I'm Korean American, and I don't really recall talking about race a lot growing up. And I also remember having that conversation with my family, like, why didn't we talk about it? My parents are wonderful. They're very well-intentioned. Like they never made me feel like different or any like othered in our family or in our community. But they were raised with this mentality of to talk about race is impolite. And they were raised in like the colorblind generation. And I still think that there's a lot of those lingering effects still going on today. Yet it's really important to recognize that somebody's racial makeup and background is often a huge component of their lived experience and who they are and their identity. And a lot of our discomfort comes from not having the opportunity to unpack who we are and our own identities. And I found that particularly for white students and for white educators, there's that real sense of discomfort. But I think when we start to have these conversations with kids, they learn from a very young age, like, oh, this isn't a stigmatized or a taboo topic, and they grow more comfortable. And that's that type of fluency that they can take into adulthood. Like I like to think about having these conversations, building fluency the same way that we think about fluency in reading or in math. Like you have to practice, you have to break down certain components and familiarize with it. And you have to practice every single day by yourself, use personal reflections or having conversations with other people, because we can't fix systemic racism if we don't talk about it. You can't fix anything unless you talk about it.
Well, and I love that there's so many more people wanting to have these conversations now out there and in the public because, obviously anybody watching this who knows me knows that I'm a white male educator. And as I've spent the last year or two really surrounding myself with people like you who push my thinking and make me educate myself over the history of everything and my own beliefs and my own things that were ingrained in me as a child that I never even knew were things that could be considered racist or anything like that. Because I remember my friend Travis Crowder and I read this book called just it came out recently, but I think it was recently, but it's called White Fragility. Have you
Oh,
heard of that one?
I'm familiar with that book.
That book like blew my mind when I just because I really wanted to go in there with an open mind and reading it, I was like, God, there's so many things that either I take for granted or I don't think through before I say. And when you truly educate yourself over that kind of stuff, you begin to see it more and more and more in everything that's happening. And now for me, now it's like everything I can see where all these conversations are coming from. And my other white friends or white educators who get so upset when they say things like you mentioned of I don't see color, or I don't know why that's a big deal, or why do we have to say it this way instead of that way? I'm like, okay, let me try and educate you because it makes more sense to me, and it's such a thing too that it's like, God, I still have so much growing to do, and so much learning, but I think you're exactly right. We have to be having those conversations as adults, regardless of how uncomfortable we may be made.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's a lot of power in people like you, white people who are aware of that privilege, aware of these inequities in society, who now have a shift in their lens. And like you were saying, once you start to think this way, you can't really undo it. You view everything, if it's consuming media or movies, books, anything like that, you start to see it from a very different perspective. But frankly, it sounds very different if you are speaking with other white people. It sounds very different coming from a white person than coming from a person of color. And that's where I think there is even, there's a lot of power in you being a white male who recognizes this, aside from like the power and privilege that like you automatically have as a white male in society.
Right.
But your message has a different type of impact, whether if it's somebody like me or somebody who's Black relaying the same message. You can easily get written off as like, oh, you're just like an angry brown person, you're just an angry Black person. But when it's somebody who you share these commonalities with, I think are more likely to sit and reflect and think, oh, that person clearly has this realization, and maybe that's something that I should consider too.
Well, and it's been funny because the more vocalized I've become about these issues, and I'm in Texas and I'm in small town Texas. And so the more vocalized I've become about this kind of stuff, it's funny because as a white person, when I say things to other white people about this, they're much more open to even accidentally show their biases to me than they would be to somebody of color. And so in having these conversations, I've been like, what? You believe that? Like, no, that's totally, don't ever say that to anybody else. But I know that like, because, I work on a staff where, there's 85 of us and maybe 20% are people of minority, people of color. And I've started having meetings with them about once every 2 months, and we call them our diversity meetings, where we talk about what are we doing as a campus that's not recognizing every student and all the families and bringing them in, and to hear the stories of things that people I work alongside deal with when they walk in a grocery store or when they have a child or all these things. It makes me even more passionate about wanting to speak up, because it's not this far-fetched idea of some other city with some other people that we don't know. When you truly start having those conversations, you connect personally with these other people, and their stories mean even more to you then. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. You have to humanize these stories. And obviously when you know a person who is impacted, it will probably land differently with you. It'll probably have a stronger impact. But I hope that throughout this work, we get to the point where you don't have to have that personal connection with somebody, that you can take somebody's experience, like their lived experience, at their word, rather than having to say, oh, well, I care because it's a friend of mine. I care because, you know, it's like the spouse of somebody I know.
Mhm.
But when we do read headlines about people's experiences, if they're facing like oppression or discrimination, that we can have empathy for them, even if we don't know them.
Mhm. So, I mentioned earlier that when you talk about this a lot, and you're really vocal and very brave in so many of the things that you want to bring to focus and bring to conversation, and I know you have to get so much pushback and so many people who will DM you based on your comments or things like that. But how do you not let that stuff get to you to a point where you're like, you know what, forget it. I'm not even sharing any of this anymore because I'm just tired of these idiots who will not leave me alone.
Well, I had a really powerful learning experience earlier this year. I made an anchor chart about consent with my class that went viral. It showed up on, you know, I was interviewed for CNN, the Washington Post, and Huffington Post, and NPR. It showed up on like talk shows. But I think it was that point where Megyn Kelly did a bit about me in the chart on her show. She's never talked.
Really?
Yeah, she's never met me before. Um, I would say that like the majority of the media attention that I got was overwhelmingly positive. Like
Mhm.
people saying like, "Oh, it's wonderful that we can finally, you know, break down this seemingly tricky subject in a way that's digestible for kids." But of course, there is like that 10% of people who
Mhm.
were trying to contact me through my work email, and which was like kind of scary, and you know, saying that
Right.
I should be blacklisted and like my credential be taken away, and calling me all sorts of names that I won't repeat here.
Yeah.
um, After a while it almost just becomes like laughable. Like to me,
Mhm.
I think at first it felt personal, and then by the end it just wasn't personal at all. And I
Mhm.
think when people have that kind of anger and are lashing out in that way, it says a lot more about them than it does about me. Um, you know, like happy people don't troll other people. Like happy people don't spend their time trying to tear other people down on social media. You know, I think it's more of a reflection of them and what they're going through, and maybe a bias or something that they're not aware of that they've suddenly been made aware of, and that doesn't sit with them, and it's easier to lash out at somebody. Um, but it can be a lot. I think it's important to take breaks over winter break from school. I logged off of Instagram for like a week and a half, and it was really nice just to be
Mhm.
able to be more present, you know, with my partner and his family, and just have one less thing to think
Right.
about.
And all I gotta say is you're so brave, because for me that's one thing that I struggle with is taking those kind of negative comments personally, and I try to keep that mindset like you mentioned as well. But sometimes it's so hard when it's people and you're like, you don't even know me. Like, why are you saying this? If you would have just asked, I would have told you this, or I could have showed you over here, or I could have explained these amazing conversations these kids had around this that they felt empowered to talk about. Um, but talking about this with kids, I love that you are having these conversations with kids, because what I found is our kids want to talk about this, but they don't know how to tell adults because adults always act like it's also off limits. And so, when did you know this was something you really wanted to make sure that you bring these kind of conversations into with your students?
Well, the first unit like that I officially did was years ago. I was teaching second grade, and I wanted to talk about gender, and I wanted to talk about stereotyping. And so Halloween seemed like a really great opportunity because the insane amount of marketing geared towards
Mhm.
children. So we did this activity where I brought in like a bunch of toy catalogs and like printed things off of like websites, just of different Halloween costumes that are marketed towards kids, and had them cut them out and sort them based on whether or not they thought they were for boys or for girls. But then they had to justify their sorting. Um, they took to it. I like it was just I just remember this moment thinking like I need to do more of this, because I saw engagement with kids who are usually not very engaged in traditional subjects like suddenly lit up and had so much to share and so many things that they wanted to talk about. I had kids coming in and saying things like, "Oh, like I watched this movie last night and it was good, but I noticed like the girl had to be saved by the boy, and like that just didn't seem
Mhm.
fair. Like I didn't really like that part." Um, and I think like like you were saying, kids assume that they don't have a place at the table. So when you give them just like a little space and show them like actually your opinion and your experiences are valid, not only are they valid, but they're welcomed here, you're going to have a whole different type of classroom community because you're showing that you value them not just for like what they can do academically, but who they are as people and what they think and what they feel. And I think that's beautiful. And those are, you know, the imprints that stay with kids throughout school. That's what makes them think that what we do in school is relevant and applicable to life outside of school.
And that it matters. Yep. What have you found is the most difficult aspect of bringing in these types of conversations with your students?
I think sometimes I get overly ambitious. I'm the type of person who feels like everything should have been done yesterday. So I don't know. I think that what I'm good at is being able to take something that seems very complicated and I know how to break it down into small, very digestible steps in a way that kids can relate to. But I think sometimes what's honestly like time is tough. Like I wish I could just do this all day long.
Yeah.
I try to find more ways to integrate this lens into what we read and what we write. And even in terms of math and science, like we're doing a big environmental science unit. I'm really trying to focus in on bringing in like environmental justice into that science unit. So yeah, just trying to, it's like a perspective that you have to take. It's not like a separate part of the day.
Right, exactly. Have you gotten any pushback from colleagues or parents or anything like that?
From minimally from colleagues who feel the pressure to do this work as well. I'm also diversity coordinator for my school. So I hope in this role this year and in years to come, I'm able to, you know, push in more to planning sessions and take a look at units at different grade levels they're doing, just to make sure it has like that equity and culturally responsive lens. My administration is very, very supportive, which is great, which is how I ended up in this position in the first place, which is wonderful. I'm very lucky to not fear my administration or to ever worry if they walk in the door that I'm going to be chastised for something that I'm doing in class. The only time I've really had parent pushback, let's see, one unit around gender, we read Jacob's New Dress, and I had some very religious parents who said were very nice about it, but didn't like the idea that their child was reading a book about a boy who was not like gender conforming. And at that point, like we had already read the book, so I was like, I don't really know what you want to do. And then another family who I'm also very close with expressed some concern when we talked about 9/11 and just that they didn't want their child to be, you know, bombarded with like extremely violent or graphic images, which I completely understand. So I think it's always really important to figure out like the root of why people have concerns rather than just assuming they are anti or like, against what you're doing. Most of the time they have extremely valid reasons for, you know, having concerns as parents or things like that.
We were just talking about that the other day about many times the parents just want to be educated alongside their child. So as long as you're keeping them in the loop and like, oh no, here's what I did, here's how we were covering it, and like, oh, okay, yeah, that's totally fine then. Because when they just hear a topic, like you mentioned 9/11, they're like, I don't want these photos. And then it's like, no, okay, I'm gonna do it carefully. I'm gonna do it age appropriately. It's okay. I understand. I got that. Now you mentioned diversity coordinator. Tell me about that.
So I have a co-teacher. I'm very, very lucky. So 2 days a week on Mondays and Tuesdays, I am the diversity coordinator for my school, and I teach Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So in those 2 days that I am out of the classroom, I have done things like tried to create more community initiatives at school, such as teaching, like running teaching tolerances, mix it up at lunch day. I organized a community service day for the entire school, like TK through 5th grade, which was really fun and got to bring in representatives from all these different nonprofits to talk about their work. I organized something called the Giving Tree, where families who qualify for free and reduced lunch could submit like wish lists for the holidays and pulling in donations from the community, and actually used Instagram to raise quite a bit of money for the families at my school. What I'm hoping to do is more work around like the units of social studies and writing and reading that grade levels are doing, just to make sure that we are representing all students, and there is no appropriation happening, or that everything's just being done as in a very culturally sensitive way.
Is this a new position?
Yep, first year.
Was it your idea?
Yeah, this was something that I pushed for starting maybe like a year and a half ago, and then or maybe 2 years ago, and this is the year that it finally came to fruition.
I love the idea of a position like that. I've never thought about that, but just having somebody who's just constantly going in and looking to help educate the educators over making sure those kind of things are happening. I think that's a brilliant idea. I'm very interested to see how this continues to go for you in growing in that position while still actively teaching in the classroom as well and carrying this. Do you find it hard sometimes to balance the two?
Yeah, sometimes. I was warned before I started by a colleague that I needed to be really careful in setting boundaries so it didn't turn into 2 full-time jobs, which I thought was really, really good advice.
Yeah.
But it's been good so far. I haven't really had any issues.
Awesome. Well, Liz, one thing I'd like to end on is if there are educators who are watching this conversation today and they want to start not only educating themselves more, but also begin to have those conversations with kids, where do you suggest them begin that process?
Sorry, I'm moving because my battery is about to die.
No problem.
I would suggest that they, first of all, start small. Like, definitely don't think that you have to go in tomorrow and shake up your entire curriculum or anything like that. But start with a topic that you already have some comfort and knowledge around, I would say. And I like to start every single unit that I do with my students with a KWL chart. And so if you don't know what that is, creating like a chart with 3 columns where you ask students, what do you know about a topic? What do you want to know about topic? And later on, like, what have you learned? Because I think that's the best way to gauge what your students are coming in with. And then when they give their wonderings in that middle column, what they want to know, that's actually what's going to take you to drive your instruction and like where the unit goes. I also think this is a pretty safe way of doing it, so you don't get accused of like preaching from the pulpit and just putting your agenda on your students. But if you have the topic, you understand what they know, and then they get to pick kind of like what direction you go in. You do have to relinquish quite a bit of control of your classroom. And I know teachers are planners, so that might be another uncomfortable thing. But I really think that's where really authentic and meaningful learning happens. And I do encourage teachers to try it that way.
Awesome. Have you heard of or read the book Being the Change by Sarah Ahmed?
Oh my goodness. I love that book very, very much.
Because that was a book that I was like, okay, this is a book I'm getting for all of my teachers. And Sarah is amazing. I love her as well. She's brilliant and doing a lot of great work. But that might be a good book for teachers to check out too, just to give some more ideas on how to guide those conversations. And really, I love the comment you just made though about being careful about not putting your own biases and having that be the focus of the lesson, and really opening it up to the kids and what they're going to learn.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at my work and assume that it's a lot of me talking at kids. But like, to be honest, it got to the point where I remember the primary from the last election, like kids were coming in, they were like, oh, like Miss Liz, like, who did you vote for? Who did you vote for? I'm like, I'm not going to tell you. Like, it's that's pretty much like where I'll draw the line. Like, you can probably infer who you think I voted for, but frankly, like, I don't want my personal political opinions to affect you in any way.
Right.
We're very careful of the language that we use. And even if I, agree with a student 100% personally, if they start, bashing certain politicians or things like that, or using language that I think is not very respectful, like, we'll pull it back.
Right. I love that. Well, Liz, I have to tell you, I was so excited when you agreed to come on, and I absolutely love your work. People, if y'all are not following her, you need to go follow her on Instagram. Liz, you push my thinking every day. You make me want to continue to educate myself. You make me uncomfortable sometimes, and I like that because that means I'm learning and I'm being pushed. And so, thank you for being a voice out there who doesn't let a myriad of factors stop them from speaking their own truth and telling their own story. And you inspire me, and I appreciate the work you do so much.
Thank you so much. That you make me cry. That was in here. Thank you so much. You filled my bucket.
Thank you. And for those of you that are listening, thank you for joining another episode of Tell Your Story. Make sure that you go out this week and find a way to be brave and tell your story, because remember that every story matters and we need to all have a voice in this conversation. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week.